go. Hey guys, this is part 2 of the Romantic period. If you haven't watched part 1, go watch it because you need to know the history to understand why the Romantics feel the way they do. So, this is a very complex era with lots of moving pieces. It's an era with a spirit of renovation, rebellion, and revolution, according to the Norton, and it's an extreme pendulum swing. In the 18th century, we had gotten to where everybody's the same, like hard formal rules for writing, lack of emotion in writing, and the Romantics come in and they're like, not up in this place, and they swing to the other side. It's going to be very emotional for them. Everyone's an individual, and we write how we want to write. It doesn't matter. It's also a unique period in terms of its name, and I know that sounds crazy, like why does it matter? But it's just kind of cool that every other literary period in British history has been named for a time period, the Middle Ages, 20th and 21st century, or for a monarch, Elizabethan, Victorian, and yet this one is named for a literary form, the Romance, which is like the medieval romances that were written medieval times, and we're going back to that. So the medieval romances are kind of like that idea of this is our heritage, this is what we wrote, and we want to go back to it. It seems simpler, it's more magical, and it allows them to use a remote and strange locale to explore their inner selves. So when their entire world is falling apart, things seem crazy, we can't even comprehend what's going on with our political events, we can remove ourselves from this, go back to a time, and really explore and think philosophically. So there's lots of characteristics that you will see across the Romantic writings. There's different schools of thought, so not all of them will use all of these, but these are key. And there's a lot of them, but we're going to get through it together. So we're focusing on adventure. We have chivalry and love. Medieval and chivalry goes so well together, I think, but like knights going on adventure, that kind of idea. We're deviating from reality and probability.
Sorry, could you say?
If you remember that, in history, it's chaos for them. Excuse my Siri, guys. Sorry. That it's chaos for them. They want to get away from it. They are unabashed about being fictional. They have no problems with the fact that what they're doing is unrealistic. They want to induce fantasy in their audience. They love the mystery of what could be happening and exploring new things. They are intensely private and individualistic, and we'll get back to that in a minute with the poets when we get there. They are returning to previous forms like folklores, ballads, oral tradition. Our old values and views are really important, going back to that nationality, that pride of being British. We're using strange and exotic lands or the past as a setting to let us break out and explore. Violating natural laws, which means the supernatural going to be big, which is going to develop the Gothic and horror setting in this time period that we love today. Well, you might love it. I don't, but so again, going back to the series, you can't emphasize it enough. We're praising natural, simple things. We love the ordinary. We want that childlike wonder of what's going on around us in the normal world, the normal people, especially in the uninhabited countryside. It is important to note that this is natural, we like the countryside, but that doesn't mean we're all about nature. Instead, we like nature for it getting us alone and private and exploring our internal passion and imagination. We are very strongly emotional. It's not fair to the female writers because they can't be as emotional as the men and still get praised, but emotions, and to the point where like it kind of drives some of the poets insane. They get really melancholy, they get really depressed because they spend so much time alone and in their emotions and their feelings that they can't break out of it. And we start exploring the dark side of humanity and looking at what does that mean. So literature and politics are shaping and impacting each other in new ways. This started in the 18th century, some with some like coffeehouse discussions and what's going on, but now we're really interested in how can art and activism interact with each other. How is my autonomy as a poet help me make me, and like also bring back the ideas of the past. When we want to see how we can move forward and change society, let's look at the past and see what we can do, because the world and country wants to move forward into a new future and they don't know how. Well, let's remove ourselves to the past and see how they did it. By 1798, Romanticism is really like going strong in Britain. So we start the periods, it hasn't gone there, and there it is. it is important to note that the Romantics did not name themselves. The Victorians do, and they kind of did it a little derogatory. They weren't very nice towards the Romantics, but whatever. They are working in a bunch of smaller schools, individual ideas of what good poetry is, what good literature is, but they all agree on a couple of things. One is that literature is actionary. Literature can help create actions, and it should inspire an actions in yourself. We also have the modern definition of literature. So when we think about literature, it's like a creative expression in writing is being developed here. And I told you this is a pendulum swing, but we're reacting to the neoclassical canon of like very rigid, very formal art has to match the Aristotle, Plato, the classics. We're rejecting that, and we're embracing our growing nationalism. So Norton kind of divides writing at this time into 4 categories. You've got poetry, you've got prose, you've got drama, and you've got novels. So we're going to kind of break it down a little bit here. Poetry is going to be our main focus because it is integral to life at this point. So as I mentioned, there's different schools of thought. So you have the Lake School, Cockney School, Satanic School, female writers, the Amazonian Band, which is a salty way of addressing feminist writers, different ideas of how things should be approached. But they all agree there's no true mold for good poetry. Good poetry is just good poetry, and it should be a way to take action. Poets believed that literature is an engine or a way to pull passion back out of people and then use that passion to reunite humanity and pull us all back together. Like I mentioned, poetry is integral to everyday life. It's so important and so everywhere that people just start publishing things randomly, and like there's a lot of like hacks out there, and people are like, oh no, this is gonna like degrade poetry, but that poetry obviously didn't last because we don't talk about it today. But I mean, people would write it down and carry it around. It was published on obituary, like in the newspapers. Someone's obituary might have a poem. A wedding notice might have a poem. It was just everywhere. Now, lyric poetry, the lyric poem becomes the major form at this time. It is the most essentially poetic form of all of the genres for the Romantics. And it does get credited to Wordsworth a lot. He is not the first one to use it, but he is the major advocate for it. It focuses on the word on I, so the individual. But what I need you to know is that the poems might be a reflection of the poet and his or her life, but that doesn't mean it always is. So be careful to say that when the poem says I killed somebody, it means the poet. All right, it's not always the case. It happens a lot. It's very individualistic period, but it's not always the case. However, female poets, typically we're staying away from this form because you know the idea that women are controlled by their emotions and they're out of control. And so a lyric poem was a very emotional poem for people to use, and so they kind of didn't use it because they didn't want to continue that stereotype of being prone to emotional outbursts. Like this poem is just another emotional outburst instead of being a good poem. So they do kind of stay away from that. Men, it's like, wow, look at this man being vulnerable and showing his feelings. But they spent a lot of time in their feelings, and it did lead to some melancholy and madness in some of the male authors going on. We do believe that poetry should develop spontaneously, should be based off of our strong feelings. There's no rules, just have an impulse. And it connects back to the nostalgic idea of ballads and folk songs that just were what they were. We'd be sitting around a campfire and be entertained, and it was wonderful, and everybody loved it, which means we're going to go back to some everyday natural language. The language may not feel natural for us as 21st century readers because, like, different centuries, but it is a very natural language for them, and they're not trying to force it into, like, certain rhymes and rhythms. They just want to use normal language in a normal way, which does evoke some sympathy out of the higher class for the lower class, maybe subconsciously, and that's one thing that people are like, hey, wait, why are we doing this? But we do return to that idea of like everyday life in nature is wonderful to explore. Let's just use normal language and be normal people and share our feelings. Authors do really insist on being self-sufficient in individuals, which does bring some censure to them because like you should be a part of society. Don't be alone out there on your own. But we also think that human potential is really high. So yeah, go out and explore yourself, and it creates this little contradiction. Poems start to promote a poet's individual vision instead of speaking for everybody, which is big for them. This is also a time where you can be famous and wealthy as a poet without having to have a patron. So you don't have to have somebody supporting you and paying for you, and you have to write what they want you to write. You can write what you want to write, and it's just so popular, you get rich. You can become a celebrity now. So, prose. Poetry may be the focus of the age, but prose also continues to expand. It was really popular. We were having a lot of civil discourse out with social issues. Dies down with repression, but some things come out of this. You have the familiar essay, which is a commentary on a topic of the author's choice, prompted by their lives typically, or something they're interested in. It has a very intimate tone, so like we're still conversing face to face, and it fits in with poetry because it's still subjective. We do have a large growing audience because everybody's starting to be able to learn to read thanks to Sunday schools, not the church Sunday school, but like a school on Sunday. And we now have someone called the critic. And the critic comes out, and they are there telling you what is good and what is not good. And that's a type of prose. So what is good literature, what is not good literature? So then finally you have the drama and the novel. Drama, not as popular in this period. 1737, they cracked down on it because they felt like it was creating too much disorder. And if it was a royal theater, they could have spoken word, but if it was not, you could only do pantomime or musical entertainment. So it's not happening a lot. Novels are very popular, but at first they're not very well respected. They're seen as attracting women too much and like creating issues where people are just like escaping into fantasy too much. But by the end of the period, they are respected. We have historical novels. Philosophy is being discussed. Like, how does the individual fit into society? How does history form an individual? Does the individual impact history? And how does this work? Sir Walter Scott, Jane Austen, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Those are all very big novelists of this age that come out. And also, like I mentioned, Gothic novels are developed for the first time, and this is going to take off like crazy, and our modern horror movies owe it to them. So there's a lot going on with this literary movement, so much that I couldn't really fit it all into this video for you. So make sure you have read the introduction to the period in your Norton, and we're going to go ahead and dive into our first part of the unit.